Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ANU. My name is Frank Jotzo. I'm Deputy Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute, and I'm your chair here for today. Professor Will Steffen, who is the Executive Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute, sends his apologies. He is away in Korea on a speaking engagement. Let me introduce the gentleman here with us today on stage. Mr. John Ashton, the UK Special Representative for Climate Change and our speaker here today. Mr. Jolyon Welch, Deputy High Commissioner in the British High Commission, and Professor Aidan Byrne, Dean of the ANU College of Physical Sciences and Dean of the College of Medicine, Biology and the Environment. Aidan, can I invite you to the lectern, please, to recognise the Indigenous landowners?
Thank you, Frank, and I'd like to add my warm welcome to the ANU to our distinguished guests. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian National University recognises that it is situated on country for which the Ngunnawal people have been custodians for many centuries and on which they have performed age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We acknowledge their living culture and unique role in the life of the region and offer our deep appreciation for their contribution to and support of our academic enterprise. Thank you.
Well, let me introduce our speaker. In June 2006, John Ashton was appointed as the UK Foreign Secretary's Special Representative on Climate Change, reporting directly to the Foreign Secretary. He's the UK Climate Ambassador. John has spent most of his career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He has founded and led its Environment Policy Department and played a key role in designing its climate change strategy. A major theme of John's career has been China. He was posted to Beijing in the 1980s and was advisor to Hong Kong's Governor Chris Patten in the 1990s. John has been continuously active in climate diplomacy in various capacities since about 1997. For instance, he was involved in negotiating the EU package on climate change, including funding for carbon capture and storage. He helped negotiate the agreement in 2005 between the EU and China to demonstrate zero-emission coal technology in China. He was a senior member of the UK negotiating team in the UN climate negotiations from 1998 to 2002, and he was closely involved in the EU's engagement with Russia over the Kyoto Protocol. John, can I invite you to the lectern? John will speak to us about the role of coal in a carbon-constrained world. It is an important topic for Australia. Australia is the largest coal exporter in the world, and coal now has a greater share in our domestic energy mix than in most other countries. John's lecture is titled Coal, the Elephant in the Room. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. John Ashton.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Aidan. I'm ashamed to admit that this is my first visit to ANU. So late in the day, I'm filling a rather large gap in my education, but at the same time, it's a pleasure to come here, particularly because I have a number of good friends who, as it were, live and work under this roof. In my distant past, when I was a China diplomat, I got to know very well Richard Rigby, who is now at the China Institute here at ANU. I would say in those days, in the mid-80s, he was the most able and effective China diplomat of any of the, if you like, the OECD countries, bar none. He knew most about China. He was taken most seriously by Chinese interlocutors. His Chinese language skills were better. So he is, in the China firmament, a real star. And an equally bright star in the climate change firmament is Ross Garnaut, who I came to know rather later. So I do feel, even though I've never been here before, I feel at home, and it's a privilege to be given a platform here. And thank you for the welcome. To respond adequately to climate change, if we want to have a fighting chance of staying within the 2-degree threshold that separates the catastrophic from the merely dangerous, we need to have a carbon-neutral energy system by the middle of the century. Not a low-carbon energy system, a zero-carbon energy system, and not in some places, but everywhere. There's going to be a dramatic shift towards electricity for vehicles and for heating, and that means that we have to go even faster than we thought to take emissions out of electricity. A reality is there's going to be a lot of coal burned before we enter the post-fossil power era. Coal is cheap, it's widely distributed, it provides the reliable baseload electricity that we need to smooth the intermittency of renewables before smart interactive grids become widely deployed. And of course, it's an essential part of any readily available route out of poverty for hundreds of millions of people, and it's also an essential part of the economy for a number of OECD countries, including Australia. And politically, we need to build a pathway that works for all of those people. We can and we must accelerate our efforts to produce and consume electricity more efficiently, and to grow markets for renewable energy technologies. That will give us, if you like, a smaller elephant. But coal is still, as I've said in the title, elephant in the living room. And if we want to fix the climate problem, we need to tame the elephant. There is no credible climate strategy that doesn't include a strategy to get very quickly to the point where carbon capture and storage becomes the universal standard for all new coal and indeed all new gas-fired power generation. And to be here in a country which has been the first to recognize that reality is a pleasure, because it creates an opportunity for the UK and Australia to have a conversation about how we can be more than the sum of our parts in building the political momentum to raise that level of ambition globally. Australia has shown real leadership. The Rudd government has shown real leadership on carbon capture and storage by setting up the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and above all, more recently, by putting real money, 2.4 billion Australian dollars, on the table at a time of economic crisis to say we're now going to start funding the construction of commercial scale demonstration plants, which I'll come back to in a moment. But before I do, I want to just tackle some of the myths that, in my view, have gained far too much currency in the debate about coal and CCS in recent years. For example, you sometimes hear the phrase clean coal. I'm sure it's a phrase widely used here. And I think that whenever you hear that phrase, you should make sure that your baloney detector is set to maximum. There's no such thing as clean coal. Extracting coal is dirty and it's dangerous. Burning it releases mercury, sulfur, and other pollutants. The phrase clean coal is open to abuse by those who either want to wish those problems away or to deflect pressure to move fast on carbon capture and storage by arguing that at this stage we should focus only on burning coal more efficiently. What we can have, if we can't have clean coal, is climate-compatible or carbon-neutral coal by applying carbon capture and storage. There are no technology obstacles to the rapid deployment of carbon capture and storage. I spent an hour last week with the chief executive of Rio Tinto, a company that has a significant interest in understanding the CCS landscape and which pays a lot of intelligent people to give good advice to the board on that question. That's certainly their view, and it's our view in the British government as well. But there are other obstacles, and we need to overcome them. And another one is the idea that CCS isn't proven. There is no critical CCS technology still to be demonstrated. What we haven't done is to combine the necessary technologies in large-scale plants that burn coal to generate electricity and to sequester carbon dioxide. That's not a technology demonstration problem, that's a cost discovery problem. That's what we need to do. Next myth, it's going to be too expensive. And I was discussing this recently with a European colleague whose decisions, the advice he gives to his Prime Minister, matter quite a lot. And he said, okay, I agree about the technology, But if we do it at scale, it'll be so expensive that we will never persuade taxpayers, consumers and shareholders to bear the additional cost. And even if we in Europe can do that, then China never will. And there's a real issue here. There's no such thing as commercially viable CCS, another phrase that sets the baloney lights flashing. It will always be more expensive to burn coal with CCS than to burn it unabated. But at the same time, there really is no reason to believe that the extra cost cannot be afforded. Spread equitably across the whole of the rate base, it will be well within the range of the kind of energy price variability that we, at least in Europe, have had to manage over the past few decades and manage successfully. Prices, including energy prices, go up and down all the time, and where such stresses become disruptive, it's the job of politics to spread the pain fairly. So in the case of CCS, as we go to scale, the cost will need to be spread across the rate base, and that'll happen in different ways in different economies according to local conditions and through instruments like the consumer levy that we're introducing in the UK to help fund our first generation of demonstrations. Those choices won't be easy because burden sharing never is, particularly in periods of fiscal tightening, which many of us are about to go through. But we know enough already about CCS to know that we can solve that part of the problem if we want to. Of course, in the debate about what's possible, the generator compares the cost of using CCS with the cost of doing something else. But that's not the cost that is facing society. For society, the comparison is not between the cost of doing CCS and the cost of not doing it. It's the comparison between the cost of living with 2 degrees of climate change or that of living in a world well beyond that, perhaps 4 degrees or more. And that inescapable reality makes CCS not an option, but an imperative, the single most pressing imperative in the global response to climate change. There's a related myth, which has been very current in my country, and I suspect has a few adherents here as well, which is that the carbon price, when we put one in place, will get us out of jail on CCS. Just wait until it's high enough, and hey presto, carbon capture and storage will do itself. Yes, we need to build the carbon market. It's one of the main challenges we face at Copenhagen, and it's one of the main weapons in any domestic armory of policies and measures to get from a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. But at the same time, don't expect the carbon price alone to deliver carbon capture and storage as quickly as we need it. Until the price signal kicks in strongly enough, we need to find other means of doing the lifting. We just can't wait. We haven't got time to wait until the price by itself, the carbon price, will do the heavy lifting. Others in this debate claim that carbon capture and storage isn't safe and will never be safe. But in fact, we have a high degree of confidence now that we can lock CO2 away securely for a very long time. The experience here in Australia at Otway has contributed to that conference, and so has the experience of the Norwegians at Sleipner in the North Sea, where the CO2 is doing exactly what the geologists expected it to do and staying where it was put. At the same time, it's wrong to, I don't want to sound dismissive about the safety argument, because we really cannot afford to repeat the mistakes of the nuclear and chemical industries on safety. The public is absolutely entitled to have its concerns taken seriously and not simply dismissed, especially in the light of their previous experience with official utterances on the safety of new technologies. And that means a big effort driven by governments, by civil society organizations, and by private sector stakeholders to address those safety concerns, and it means total transparency from the start about CCS. So having addressed some of the myths, the question is, what now? And I think what we need to do is to get from a position which has been prevalent in most countries where this is an issue at all, where among the players who really count, there has been a kind of dominant view that this isn't going to happen because governments aren't going to do the heavy lifting required to get the demos in place that will give you cost discovery and open a pathway to getting to scale. That's been the kind of smart insider view up now. And what we need to do is to create the opposite view that this is inevitable. And actually, if you want to be a serious player in energy markets, you can't afford to be left behind. We need to create a kind of an unstoppable momentum. And I think to do that, we need to find a way to bring those governments and those interests who identify with a high ambition approach to carbon capture and storage together onto a common platform. What would the elements of such a platform be? And I'm here in Australia partly to explore with ministers here and other colleagues whether there would be interest in working with the UK in trying to construct, if you like, a sort of 6-point common agenda, common platform on carbon capture and storage as a reference point, a nucleation point for a high ambition drive, a political surge, if you like, on CCS. What would the elements of a platform like that be? I think the first one, already covered really, would be an explicit recognition of the imperative that if you want to have energy security and climate security, and of course you can't have one without the other, then rapid deployment at scale of CCS is an imperative. It's not been widely enough acknowledged and said yet, and even in those countries that are talking about demos, there isn't a strong enough debate about why you're doing the demos, which is to get to scale in the next stage. The second point, perhaps the most challenging of them, what's the timetable we need? It's becoming pretty clear that if we want to live in a 2-degree world, then we have to get to the point where from 2020 or not long afterwards, in all of the economies where coal and gas are significant contributors to power generation, that full carbon capture and storage will need to be applied to new coal build and actually new gas build as well. And at that point, we also need to have retrofitted a lot of the capacity that's already there by then. So full CCS by 2020, or certainly not long after CCS, in all of the major countries that depend on coal and gas, that would be part of such a platform as well. It's a level of ambition which I think at the moment would have broader recognition in some of the industrialized countries than it would in some of the emerging economies where it needs to apply. But if you want to strengthen the hand of those in the emerging economies who are trying to raise the level of ambition, then they have to see industrialized countries moving ahead of them in that direction. So I think to create that sense of momentum, a third point in a platform would be a call on other industrialized countries to make a similar commitment. A fourth point, which is really a way of concretizing the first three, would be a commitment to work in all of the available international arenas, in the International Energy Agency, the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, which is meeting shortly, the UN climate negotiations, the G8, the G8+5, the G20, and so on, to use all of those levers to get agreement within the next few months on a detailed blueprint for the 20 commercial scale demonstrations that the major economies through the IEA and the G8 have already committed to building in principle, but we keep recycling the same promise without making the plan and funding the plan. And now's the time where the rubber hits the road. We need to do that. And at the same time, I think we need to talk about how we can accelerate the timetable for those 20 plants so that we have them operational by 2015 or so, rather than 2020. That would be point 4. Point 5, I think it's incumbent on those of us in the industrialized world to make a really active commitment to work with the emerging economies where CCS is also going to be an issue, not least to enable them to host a significant number of demos, 4 or 5 or 6 demos in the first wave, and that means facilitating the necessary conditions on finance, how do those demos get paid for, and on the ownership of intellectual property, which is created as the demos get built. And at the same time, to use that conversation to encourage those countries to adopt a similar 2020 timetable, which, as I said, I don't think you could yet get critical mass of support for example, in China. And then I think final point, but absolutely vital, we have Copenhagen coming up. And in Copenhagen, we're talking about building a set of financial mechanisms to finance the accelerated flow of low-carbon technology. If those financing mechanisms don't explicitly recognize the CCS imperative and the need to channel finance for the accelerated demonstration and deployment of CCS, then we won't have financing mechanisms that are worth very much. So we need an explicit recognition of CCS, the need for accelerated CCS in those mechanisms that emerge. So we have an agenda. It's now in focus. I'm proposing, the UK is proposing that a core group of like-minded countries, and I think it would be hugely significant if Australia were to join us in such a venture, should coalesce around that platform. But at the same time, let me say also, this isn't just a challenge for governments. It's a challenge for some of the environmental NGOs who want to put an end to coal use. They need, if they wanted to keep clinging to that position, to their current position, to move beyond simply expressing a preference for a world without coal to a credible explanation of how they think China, India, and many others can be persuaded to stop building any new coal plants right now and to close all that they have already built in the next decade. That's the challenge for them. I think it's an unmeetable challenge. And as for the utilities and the coal interests, you can make one of two bets. You can either gamble that the future will look very much like the present, that governments will do little to tackle the problem of climate change, and in that case it might make sense to wait and see on carbon capture and storage, or you can bet that governments will make a serious effort and that they will initiate a rapid low-carbon transition. And in that position as a shareholder, I'd want to get ahead of the curve by pressing governments to move faster on carbon capture and storage and by initiating the delicate but critical public-private negotiation that needs to take place on sharing the additional costs. And at present, in some countries, there are those who, while appearing to support carbon capture and storage, don't seem to be doing very much to remove the obstacles. They risk having abrupt change forced upon them. It was a British historian who said that if a thing be not done, it'll do itself and in a way that pleases no one, and they should pay attention to that saying. This is all going to come together, or it needs to be brought together at Copenhagen. In 30 plus years as a professional diplomat, I don't think there has ever been an international gathering of more significance than the one that's going to take place in Denmark at the end of the year. If you want to know whether the agreement that we reach at Copenhagen is a credible one, what I would say is just ask if it opens the path to the universal deployment of carbon capture and storage. Does it deal with the financing of the demonstration plants, with the sharing of intellectual property and going to scale? And if it doesn't, then please send us negotiators back to try harder. Thank you very much, and I think there may be a little bit of time left for discussion. Very happy to take whatever questions you want to throw at me or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And we have just over 10 minutes for discussion. So I invite you to very clearly raise your hands. It's difficult to see you from the podium. To please state your name and affiliation, and to please keep your questions nice and short. Just to kick off while we're getting organized, John, you made very clear that CCS-powered electricity will be more expensive than conventional coal. Who will be expected to pay for the cost of both R&D and the wide deployment of CCS? Should it be the countries that have the most willingness to pay for climate change mitigation, including Europe? Should it be the large coal exporters? So Australia is very big in there, the coal exporters who have a lot to lose from the devaluation of their resource base, or should it in fact be the large users of coal, including developing countries like China, like India, like Indonesia? And we have questions over here and somewhere else.
Do you want me to
Okay.
While we're getting organized. I mean, it's the key distributional problem, if you like. You mentioned R&D. There is, of course, a huge need for continuing R&D on carbon capture and storage, but that's not, as I see it, the key financing issue. The key financing issue is demonstrations, because the additional cost of demonstrations, round about $1 billion a shot, if you like, are so significant. And if you can afford to fund the demonstrations, you can probably afford to fund the R&D as well. I think, first of all, these demonstrations need to map a technology space, the various technologies that are available for the combustion of coal and the various options for storage. They need to map also a number of different legal and even cultural spaces to act as a focal point for building communities of interest on CCS in all of the countries where CCS is critical. So we need to make sure that there's a kind of rational distribution of plants. I think in the OECD countries it's very simple. It's not difficult, for example, in Europe to work out what is the set of demonstrations that we need to be building. We've just put in place a mechanism for financing those at European level, which will supplement what we do at national level. But the EU as a whole and its member states specifically, but the same would apply to other OECD countries, need to come up with financing solutions that work politically in their terms. And the point about that is that the solution will be different in different places. I don't think you can have a one-size-fits-all model in trying to say how you distribute between consumers, shareholders, and taxpayers. It needs to grow out of local realities. But the harder question is demonstration in emerging economies. Who's going to pay for the additional cost of demonstrations in China, in India, in South Africa, Indonesia, and so on? And I think we haven't got the full answer to that at the moment. The Copenhagen financing debate is certainly part of the answer, and if we can institute a global carbon price system, that can make a contribution as well, although I've said it can't do all of the heavy lifting. I think, you know, the reality is we need those demonstrations to happen faster than they probably would with no external intervention in those countries. So the choice facing us is, do we intervene, do we make available financial flows from rich countries to emerging economies in order for that to happen, or do we say we're not going to do that because it's too difficult to have a conversation about money going from the north to China or India, and therefore we must be honest and live with the consequences of slower deployment of carbon capture and storage in those countries. We can't afford slow deployment of carbon capture and storage in China. I think if we can engage in the right kind of debate, we can build a partnership where as it were, we meet each other some way in between. But I think we are going to have to recognize that part of this will be significant financial flows into those countries where we need CCS to happen more quickly than it otherwise would. And I recognize that's difficult, but this whole subject is difficult, and that's what politics is for, in a sense.
We'll take questions in pairs. We have number one here, and then over there.
Okay, David Denham is my name, and I'd like to ask you how the UK analysis has gone with nuclear versus carbon capture and storage, because clearly if we're going to get down to zero carbon situation by the middle of this century, and the demand for energy is going to continue to rise, which it surely will, nuclear is also an option, and we know that's a technology that works as well. So you must have done some analysis comparing these two methods. How do the costs and effectivenesses balance up?
Sorry, we'll take two in a row. Okay, well, I'll wait for the second question. Yeah.
Yes, Dirk von Behrens, ACT Greens. I'm wondering whether you are aware of the latest study that's come out in Germany, which of the 9th here, of the 9th of September, that new coal-based, carbon-based power plants at a cost of around 2 billion euros each are highly suspect in the present circumstances, in the kind of settings that Germany has in terms of support for other kinds of, and whether you'd like to comment on that.
Can you just explain what you mean by highly suspect? I'm not sure
that financially there is a significant risk, in view of the sort of scenarios that you've pointed out, of these power plants not meeting their economic goals and therefore having to be closed down and therefore being at a disadvantage to other forms, including a super intelligent grid network and energy efficiency as a means of progressing towards zero carbon emission.
Thank you very much. First of all, on CCS versus nuclear, I've always felt that the CCS problem is an order of magnitude more significant than the nuclear problem in thinking about how to respond to climate change. And the world's most aggressive nuclear new build program is in China. I think they've just recently increased their already high level of ambition. Can't remember how many gigawatts they're now planning to put in by 2020 and 2030, but it's just gone up. It's several tens, 40 gigawatts or so, I think, by 2020 now. There's a real question about whether they can meet that level of ambition. Is there enough concrete and steel and trained nuclear engineers available to do that while doing all of the other things that you need concrete and steel for in the Chinese economy? It's interesting. But even if they do, then nuclear will still be a much smaller proportion of power generation than coal in China under any scenario. And even if renewables are also being increased in proportion as ambitiously as China wants to do. So that's why it's the elephant in the room. Unless that new coal build in China is climate compatible, then we don't have a climate solution, whatever happens on nuclear. And that's not true, of course, the other way around. On the economics of nuclear versus carbon capture and storage, I think there is, at first sight, if you like, an inbuilt tension between the two. And I would say, as somebody who's been making the CCS case in Europe over the last few years, it's quite striking to me that there has been no more skillful set of interests trying to lower the level of ambition on CCS than some of those with large nuclear interests in Europe. They've been far more skillful than some of the environmental groups who just have that more primal opposition to CCS. The fact is, we won't know the precise answer to your question until we've built the demos, because you've got to get the cost discovery. Well, this is not about the demos per se. This is about a world where we go to scale on CCS. And we don't know exactly what that cost curve looks like and how far we can drive down it. I think if you talk to some of the companies that are putting money into R&D, there are some quite exciting developments that suggest that we'll be able to get the costs down significantly more than some of the studies that have been done so far are projecting. But nobody knows. I don't believe anybody who tells me that they know what it will cost at scale, except, of course, it will cost significantly more than not doing CCS. That's a reality. If we decided that it was a vital matter of security and prosperity, a vital matter of national interest, to get all of our power from CCS or to get all of our power from nuclear, we could find ways of doing it, just as the previous US administration persuaded the American taxpayer that it was worth mobilizing $700 million a day on Iraq. I'm not commenting about the rights and wrongs of that, but if you think that the interest that you're trying to protect is important enough, then it's amazing what you can do to mobilize resources in pursuit of it. I think, you know, we'll find that we get to different proportions of our energy mix. That one thing that recent decades have taught us in Europe is that it's among the harder things to do to try and lecture other countries on what's the right energy mix from the outside. Those things are always rooted in domestic politics. But we've got to do the CCS. In my view, the case for nuclear is not as strong. It will depend on the currents that flow in different countries, but it's not so critical. Highly suspect economics of CCS plants, well, the same applies. We can't do this if the only way of doing it means that the shareholders of the utilities kick out the chief executives and boards of those utilities. That's true. At the same time, not everything that the utilities have been saying publicly needs to be taken at face value. Utilities, like everybody else, become very skillful in gaming a situation where there's political uncertainty to their advantage. And as I said in my speech, we need to construct a public-private partnership that works for the taxpayer and the consumer and the shareholder at the same time. That's available, in my view. I think that you could build a very interesting discussion, and I'm oversimplifying it to some extent, but around the notion that where you say that the taxpayer will fund, or taxpayer and consumer between them will fund the additional costs of building the generation of demonstrations that we need in the period up to about 2020, and the utilities will accept that this has to be mandatory. Full CCS has to be mandatory from CCS. And you know, we can work out how to spread the costs. But the mandatory signal, there are very few countries yet where there is a consensus that you need mandatory. But in my view, that's exactly what you need to provide the certainty to drive the technology. Technology doesn't drive itself. You need a really clear signal to drive it. More questions?
We don't want to make you late for your next high-level meeting, so I'm afraid we'll
take one more. Very happy to take one more if I'm...
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Tony Kevin here.
Please
can you
brief.
hear me? Tony Kevin, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you because these lights are so bright that you're just a kind of dark, amorphous...
I don't know if I'm on microphone or not. I am.
I can hear you clearly.
Former diplomat, author of a book, Crunch Time, on climate change, and a skeptic about CCS. Every dollar that governments spend on CCS, and you said governments have to do the heavy lifting, and you're right, is a dollar opportunity cost taken out of renewable energy research. How much is the UK government spending on research into efficient, reliable, renewable energy-based grids? And how does that compare to what the UK government is spending on CCS?
I would contest your premise. I don't think it's a zero-sum game like that. The reality is that if we want to have a credible response to climate change, we all need to be mobilizing a much more resource into building a zero-emission energy system very quickly. We need a level of mobilization which, if we achieve it, will feel somewhat equivalent to wartime mobilization. So it's much more about making the overall pie bigger than it is about saying we're stuck with the pie that we've got and we're making direct trade-offs between one or the other. That's in addition to the questions about how different generation sources, the balance between baseload and intermittent sources, the amount of investment that you put in smart grids, which can open up the possibility of different balances. I think those are the key political questions that really matter. As far as the UK commitment to renewable energy, I mean, we currently get something like, I can't tell you exactly how much money in our last budget went into it, but we get, I think, between 2 and 3% of our electricity from renewables at the moment. And we recently published a white paper setting out how we intend to get to a point where we're getting over 30% of our electricity from renewables by 2020, which is a pretty disruptive. There are lots of people out there in the market who just don't believe it's going to happen. That's a very high rate of change. It's one that we've kind of forced on ourselves because we have left it so late to really get moving. I don't see that as in fundamental conflict with CCS, but we do need to think through how we make the overall mix coherent, including the grid investment, the smart grid investment that we need to have, as well as the investment in the energy sources.
We'll take one more very quick question. It's on.
Yeah, I was just wondering, you said carbon capture and storage, that the carbon can be held in the earth for a long time. How long exactly can it be held for? Can it be held forever? And is there an infinite amount of storage capacity?
I'm not a geologist, so I should admit that up front, but I talk to a lot of geologists and I read the reports that have been written on this. As I said, there seems to be a consensus in that world that you can store it for very long periods of time, and you're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of years or longer if you put the right if you put those kind of specifications on what you do. It's absolutely crucial that we don't cut corners in that. We can't afford errors. We can't afford to be telling the public that it's going to stay there and then find that actually it's not staying there, and that's why the Otway and Sleipner and other experiences are so critical, because we need to continue building confidence in the models. But I think in terms of the generational time frames that we're talking about geological rather than political timetables, which is what we need. Sorry, the second part of your question, you can just repeat that? Again, the knowledge base is still being consolidated, but it's strong enough to say that for practical purposes, given the requirements, there's enough to make the CCS case stand up. In other words, there's enough to take the edge off the climate problems associated with burning coal and gas. In many countries, in the right places. There are one or two countries where that's not the case. In Europe, Greece is a very interesting example because they get a lot of their electricity from burning lignite, but Greek geology, as you know, is seismically quite unstable. India, many Indians will tell you that the basalts that are typical in India are not going to provide the right kind of repositories. And so I think those cases need to be dealt with. The emerging knowledge in China is much more positive. There's a lot of storage capacity in some European countries, those around the North Sea in particular, as there is in the United States and many other countries. So there is enough, and it's widely dispersed enough to give us confidence that the whole construct can stand up, but there'll be some specific problems that will also need to be addressed for some countries. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very, very much, John. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think we're going away with some new insights and a lot of food for thought as well. On behalf of the Climate Change Institute, I'm looking forward to welcoming you again in the near future to other public events that we will be putting on in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference. Thank you very much.
And I